Christopher Coleman was born a bouncing baby boy in 1977, and you can say evangelism was one thing that ran in his blood. His parents, Ronnie and Connie Coleman, were both pastors for a non-denomination Christian church. Chris grew up in a very conservative background, an all-American salt-of-the-earth type. Chris was described as an even-tempered, but was also known to be soft-hearted and even described as sensitive. In high school, Chris signed up for an ROTC, and after graduating, he became a Marine. Chris enjoyed the Marine life, and to him it was serving God and country. While Chris was still in the service, he met his future wife, Sherry Weiss. Born in the same year as Chris, 1977, Sherry was born and raised in Cook County, Illinois. Sherry was a member of the U.S. Air Force. Sherry was raised different than Chris, as in August of 1977, Chris came to visit his family and brought Sherry to meet Chris's family. It was a surprise to Chris's family as they described her as a worldly girl. Sherry had a tattoo on her leg. You could say Sherry was Chris's total opposite. Nonetheless, they soon after got married. To the shock of Connie and Ronnie, Chris's parents, Chris and Sherry had eloped. Chris's father, Ronnie, had said, "My gosh, he was raised in the church. He was repentant and broken over it because Chris had regrets soon after getting married to Sherry." Though repentant, Sherry had came to Chris and told them that they were expecting a baby. Chris and Sherry welcomed their first son on April 30th, 1998, and named him Garrett Dominique Eugene Coleman. Chris says he didn't want a broken home, so he stayed in the relationship. In 2000, they welcomed their second son, Gavin Christopher Coleman. A couple years later, Chris and Sherry welcomed their second son in 2000. His name was Gavin Christopher Coleman. Chris and Sherry settled down in Columbia, Illinois, a very small town on the banks of the Mississippi River. Sherry was a stay-at-home mom, and Chris had a very high-profile job working for joyceMeyer Ministries. Sherry was a stay-at-home mom, running the kids backward and forward to sporting events. Chris worked for a high-profile, world-renowned minister, joyceMeyer Ministries, across the river in St. Louis, Missouri. Chris was on the road more days of the year than off, and though stressful on the family, Chris and Sherry made a good life as Chris's salary paid very good. Though very stressful on the family, as Chris was on the road more days than not, Chris accompanied joyceMeyer as her personal bodyguard all around the world. The boys would say that they really missed their dad being on the road. They knew the greater purpose for their dad in serving God and making a living. Chris and Sherry didn't have a perfect relationship. They occasionally fought about money. As Chris said Sherry was spending it too quickly. Sherry would also complain to Chris that she was getting little to no affection from him when he would come home. Sherry would complain to her girlfriends that he wouldn't give her any affection even during intimate moments. Even years later, Connie and Ronnie would complain about Sherry, saying she never quite fit into the family. Sherry was known to be more fun-loving with the children, and Chris was to be more the strict disciplinarian. Chris liked to run a more militant house, so the little that Chris was home for more than a few days, it brought home tension. Chris was not even known to be very affectionate toward his children. He expected more excellence in the children's grades, sports, and anything that they put their mind to. Nonetheless, in their marriage, both wanted to make it work for the kids. In the early winter of 2008, Chris told his best friend that he planned on divorcing Sherry, but said he was going to give it some thought after the holidays and then would talk to Sherry. Sherry, on the other hand, had spoke to her best friend, saying that she could tell a difference in Chris, expecting that he may be having an affair. Sherry had introduced Chris to a girlfriend of hers, one evening at an event, noting that she felt something was off with her husband and her friend. Even though Sherry felt like Chris was having an affair with her best friend, she wanted to make the marriage work regardless. Chris wasn't very keen on divorce as well after he thought about it, as it could compromise his job with joyceMeyer Ministries, as divorce was frowned upon, possibly in the eyes of the ministry and definitely in the eyes of God. One day, Chris checked the mail as he had a few days off from the ministry. It was a less than Christian note made of bodily harm to Chris and his family. After he went back to work, there had been some emails sent to joyceMeyer Ministry threatening Chris, similar to the messages that was written by mail to his home. The death threats accused joyceMeyer of, quote, preaching BS and threatened Chris' family, saying, I will unalive them while they're asleep. Naturally, this worried Chris and Sherry, so the security guard made sure security was a little more tight around the home while he was gone, as progressively the letters kept getting worse and was escalating in violence. Chris had sent these letters to the local police along with the emails from joyceMeyer Ministry. Chris had asked the local police to watch the area in the neighborhood while he was gone. His neighbor happened to be an officer for the Columbia Police and had a camera pointing at the house just in case. The final letter arrived in April of 2009 and said, "This is my last warning. Your worst nightmare is about to happen." In the early morning hours of May 5th, 2009, Chris left his home at approximately 5:45 a.m. to go to the gym. He said he always called Sherry a few minutes later after he had left the house to make sure she was up. Chris said he had called multiple times and texted, but she had still not answered, which was very unusual. When Chris was on his way home, he called his neighbor, saying he had this sinking worry feeling, and asked for the Columbia, Illinois police officer to go check on Sherry and the boys. He said he was less than 10 minutes away and would be there. Shortly. Chris and Sherry's neighbor, who was the police officer, knew that they had been getting threatening letters and had not seen anything on his camera, but nonetheless asked for a detective to come meet him so they could check on Sherry and the boys while Chris was on his way home. As soon as they was walking around the house, they quickly noticed a screen out of the back of one of the windows in the home. Both officers immediately called for backup, but continued to enter the house. After entering the home, they both said they were nearly knocked down by the power of the smell of spray paint. With their guns drawn, they started checking room by room, unsure if there was anyone in the house. Spray painted on the wall, there was the words, "Punished, I am watching you, you have paid." They had cleared the downstairs, and just moments later, Chris had arrived home. The officers heard him in the driveway and quickly went outside, asking Chris to stay outside as they cleared the upstairs. As the police went upstairs, they found the deceased bodies of Garrett, Gavin, and Sherry Coleman. The police chaplain informed Chris Coleman that his family was deceased. Chris dropped to his knees and started crying. Chris's father, Ronnie, and joyceMeyer arrived shortly after to comfort Chris in his grief. Chris and the police chaplain were in the ambulance trying to comfort Chris. The chaplain said Chris looked down at his knuckles and there were red marks. The chaplain asked him about the red marks, and Chris began to punch the gurney over and over. Later that evening, the Columbia Police Department brought Chris down for an initial interview to explain what had happened that day. Chris had said he had spent the day before playing with his children and watching television. Chris said that he and Sherry put the boys to bed and then cuddled. Chris said Sherry fell asleep in his arms. Chris explained that he got up early to go to a workout and tried to call and text Sherry, but there was no reply. Chris said when Sherry didn't reply, that's when he got worried and asked his neighbor to check on the family, because they had been receiving threats in the recent weeks leading up to the murders. The Columbia Police Department thought it was odd that Chris never mentioned his own security tapes, which may have caught the intruder breaking into the home. Authorities asked Chris if he and Sherry had any marital problems, which Chris mainly denied. They asked if Chris had been seeing anyone. They asked if Chris was having any affairs, in which Chris said he just had a, quote, friend, but denies an intimate relationship or affair. Chris says his friend's name is Tara Lentz. Tara was a friend from Sherry's high school. She had introduced Tara to her husband in November the year before. From the beginning, the Columbus Police Department felt like something was off. Tara Lentz had lived in Florida, and local police had started interrogating her. Tara had said that indeed her and Chris had been having an affair and had shared promise rings, and that they were engaged to be married in January 2010. Tara said that Chris had failed to mention that he canceled the family's Disney trip and booked a cruise to the U.S. Virgin Islands for Tara and himself. According to Tara, Chris was going to serve Sherry with divorce papers the day of the murder. Tara said she had already several wedding registries and was looking for homes for their family and discussing baby names for their new upcoming family. When DNA testing came back from under Sherry's nails, it was consistent with Chris's DNA, but not a definite match. Paint from the walls, laptop computers, phones were also sent to be examined. They had also checked the email address that was destroychris@gmail.com, and was later determined that the IP address came directly from Chris Coleman's own laptop. Forensic also realized that the letters had several misspellings in common with Chris Coleman's own writings. Later, the autopsies was determined that Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin lives had ended by strangulation. The medical examiner put their time of death before 5 a.m., which is consistent that Chris Coleman was still in the home during the time of the murders. According to the medical examiner, Sherry's body showed signs of rigor mortis, which was crucial in determining the time of death. Remember the handwriting paintings on the wall? A forensic handwriting specialist says they were consistent with the knowing writings of Chris Coleman. Upon examining Chris's bank statements, they had found a purchase from a small hardware store in St. Louis of the paint matching the spray paint writings on the wall. On May 19, 2009, Chris was arrested and charged with the triple homicide. As expected, he pleaded not guilty at trial. JoyceMeyer was called to testify and specifically answer whether Chris would lose his job if he was found out he was having an adulterous affair. JoyceMeyer said that it could potentially jeopardize his job. On the stand, when JoyceMeyer was asked if he would lose his job, she responded by saying not necessarily. She reviews that on a case-by-case basis. Regardless, this was a major contributing factor in the motive for Chris to commit the triple homicide murders. When the jury deliberated, they were having trouble coming up with the verdict. Then they dug back through the evidence. A picture of Chris and Lentz kissing had a date, October 2008, written on the back. Chris always maintained that their relationship began in November, which proved he was lying. While already leaning towards guilt, they concluded that if Chris lied about this in their relationship actually started, then he was probably lying about everything else. Christopher Coleman was found guilty on all 3 counts and was sentenced to 3 life sentences without the opportunity of parole. All of his appeals were denied, but in March 2019, a judge granted Chris a chance at a new trial on the grounds of ineffective counsel. A new trial has yet to be granted. Thank you all so much. If you haven't already subscribed yet, please consider. God bless each and every one of you. Be safe out there, and we'll see you on the next one.